Next up is the sample that I applied preserver to, and wow.
Oh, wow.
That's not good at all. This is much softer. Oh my God.
So fairly surprising here. Today's video is brought to you by Nationwide Industries, the Fence Pros' #1 choice. And they're this Fence Pros' choice for a couple reasons. The most recent reason? Gate kits. They've paired their most popular hinges with their most popular latches in the most common post sizes to make it easier to grab and go. Also, as a consumer, it makes sure you know you've got the right hinge for the right latch. For example, if you've got a pull gate, they've got a pull gate kit just for you. It's got the Cornerstone hinge in it. It's got the Trident 20-inch. Both some of our most popular gate hinge hardwares. You've got a vinyl fence with 5-inch posts. They got you covered. They've got their Cornerstone 2 hinge. They've got the Keystone reverse latch, which I love a lot. They've also got a handle in there. But if you have a vinyl fence with, say, a 4-inch post, they've got that too. All at Nationwide Industries. Check them out in the link below. All right, guys, today's video is titled, Do Wood Treatments Really Work? Unexpected Results, which obviously grabs attention. It's from the Rag and Bone Brown channel. If you'd like to watch the full video in its entirety without my commentary, I'll link that in the description below. With all that being said, let's dig into it.
3 years ago, I set up an experiment. I was keen to understand if it's really worth treating outdoor timber or if tannalization and pressure treatment on timber actually works. So here is the experiment at the top of my garden, but first, over to Keith from the past. Hello, Keith from the past here. The date is currently Monday, the 21st of June, 2021, and I've prepared 6 samples of untreated 3x2s, 3 of which I'm going to leave as is, and 3 of which I'm going to treat myself using a wood preserver. And I've got another 6 samples of pressure treated 3x2, 3 of which have the pressure treated end still on them, and the other 3 have a freshly cut end on both sides. For these samples that I'm treating myself using a wood preserver, I'm going to apply a generous coat, let it dry, and then apply another generous coat. I'm even going to dunk the end grain in the treatment. That's actually what it recommends to do on the tin. I labelled up each.
Well, so let's think about this for a second. So pressure treated is obviously treated with pressure.
Obviously.
But they'll pressurize these tanks with the product in it, the product being the wood, and force it into every nook and cranny of that board, and in between all the fibers, in between, just it completely penetrates the wood. If we're just using a product that you paint on, I'm not sure you get the same effect. I mean, obviously, the outer coating, the shell, I guess, you'd create a shell, would be treated, but like that inner core wouldn't be. Interested to see how this turns out.
Sample with a marker pen accordingly and place them in 3 different scenarios at the top of our garden. The first scenario is outside, laying on the ground horizontally so that the side grain of the timber is in contact with the ground. The second scenario is with the samples placed vertically so that the end grain is in direct contact with the soil. And the third scenario is with each of the samples placed in a bucket of water. And over the past 3 years, each of the test pieces has endured all that the British weather had to throw at them, including being buried deep in snow, extreme dry spells where the water in the bucket had completely evaporated, the occasional bit of ice, and of course lots and lots of rain. Before we take a look at the samples though, let's talk about why we might consider treating our wood in the first place.
We're actually going to skip ahead here to the results. He talks about why would you want to treat your lumber, and also like what treatments are available. Like I said, the full video is available in the description below.
I've been waiting 3 years for this. I'm going to get these into the workshop and get them cleaned up so that we can take a closer look. I can definitely see some decay and some insects. Lots of wood lice and a slug. And finally, the water sample, which has lots of grass growing in it. Most of the marker pen has worn away, but I was very careful in which order I placed them in the ground, and I've examined the footage so I know which is which. But just so that I don't make any mistakes, I think it's worth writing on these which is which. Right, so the samples have now dried out. Let's take a closer look at them. And
Before we get into it, why don't you put your guesses in the comments below? So our options are completely untreated lumber, lumber hand treated, or I guess treated in at home DIY style. There's a fully pressure treated with the end grain still intact, still coated. Then there's the pressure treated with the end grains cut off. So obviously these are just short segments. I wonder how he has the end grain intact. I guess the end grain would be intact on one side that he had put probably in ground contact. Interested to see the results here in the pressure treated with the ends cut off. This could be a pressure treated post put in the ground. Now, granted, then we have a different discussion on what are these treated. They're pressure treated, but what are they treated with? Is it ground contact, or now they have extreme ground contact? Maybe there's further discussion there. Most commonly, you wouldn't cut a post off in the ground, right? You would set it. If you are using longer posts and you set them wild, just means taller than the actual fence, and you cut them exactly to the height, you would have exposed grain to the elements, but not necessarily in the ground. What I'm really interested in is exposed grain on the rails, because a lot of times when wood fence is getting built, the rails are cut to section, and those ends are rarely treated. Curious to see the end grain that was just exposed to the elements, not treated. Like I said, drop your comments in the comments below. Which do you think performs the best?
the first scenario we're going to look at is where the samples were placed upright with their end grain in direct contact with the soil. And I'm going to give each of the samples a rating based on how much decay has occurred. Not very scientific, I know, but I'm not a scientist. So the first sample is the untreated one, and if I look at the bottom, I can see that quite a lot of decay has occurred.
Not actually as much as I would have expected. He said 3 years, so it's still relative. If we're thinking about fences, that's still relatively new in the age span of a lifespan of a fence. You would expect, or I would have expected, to see more rot and decay there at the end grain.
And some of that decay is also creeping up the sides. I measured the surface area of end grain that showed signs of decay using CAD software, and it made up 34% of the total area of the end grain. So I'm going to give this a decay ratio of 3.4 out of 10. Some of the wood fibres at the very end, I can also pick away just using my fingers. This area here is particularly rotten. And if I give it a good squeeze, wow. I'm going to rate this 5 out of 10 in terms of softness, based on nothing scientific, just my own judgment really. Next up is the sample that I applied preserver to, and wow.
Oh, wow.
That's not good at all. This is much softer. Oh my God.
So fairly surprising here. You would think that the preservative on the outside, the sealant on the outside would keep it more protected than the untreated. I wonder if placing that sealant on the outside trapped moisture in and maybe promoted rot from the inside out.
This is actually much softer than the untreated sample. This is terrible. And for all these years, I've been using wood preserver. Maybe I shouldn't have bothered. Well, that is absolutely horrendous. Decay ratio on this one is a whopping 83%. So this gets an 8.3 decay ratio out of 10. And in terms of softness, it's a 9 out of 10. Next is the pressure treated timber with a freshly cut end. And there's quite a lot of decay on here too. Some of it's creeping up the sides again, but it's not as bad as the untreated sample. And
that somewhat makes sense, right? The pressure treating makes sure that the product, the lumber here, is pressure treated from end to end, core to outside. You'd expect to see that. So this is one thing I've always wondered, is exposing that cut end, if it's pressure treated, if it has treatment throughout the product, how big of a risk is it not treating the cut ends? Again, I think this looks pretty solid. I mean, obviously he's picking away at it, so it's not perfect, but it's still interesting to see.
There are a few areas that I can pick at with my fingernail, but generally this is a little bit firmer than the other samples we've looked at so far. Area of decay on this, 3 out of 10, and I'll rate this 3.5 out of 10 in terms of softness. And finally, this is the pressure treated with the uncut end, so this end is full of preservative. Other than this small area here and some decay at the sides, it actually looks really quite intact, and I can't break away any of this with my fingers or fingernail, so I'm going to say this is the best one so far. area of decay 0.7, and a 1 out of 10 for softness. The next scenario was with the side grain in contact with the ground, and this is the untreated sample. And I don't know if this will show up on camera, but the grain is really quite deep. I can get my thumb right in there, and I can see some damage at the end here. This end is actually okay. I can't scrape any of this away with my fingernail, apart from a little bit here at the very end. Area of decay 4.4 and 3 out of 10 for softness. Next up is the sample that I applied preserver to, and oh dear, once again, this is incredibly soft. Yeah, it's definitely a lot worse than the first sample, which was completely untreated. So not good at all.
So it almost looks like the products he treated himself were actually faring a lot worse than just straight untreated. Imagine spending money on the preservative and putting the time into, if this was a full fence, only to see these results.
Oh my God. I can pick away so much of this. Not good at all, and even in this area where it looks okay, again, the grain has sunken in quite a lot. There's some damage at the end. Area of decay 6.9 and 8 out of 10 for softness. This is the pressure treated with an uncut end. This has had quite a big chunk of it eaten away, but actually it's pretty firm. And this time there's none of that sunken grain in this area. Area of decay 3.
Surprised to see the pressure treated, the long grain there, the side grain, still is eaten away quite a bit, or is deteriorated quite a bit, whether it's rot or insects. That's surprising to see as well. I really thought it would have fared better.
0.4, but with this one I do wonder if there may have been some kind of defect in the grain that might have weakened the corner here or something. Certainly it was intact when I put it down, and I checked the ground around where the samples were and there were no chunks laying on the ground, so I can only assume it has been eaten away. Softness, 2 out of 10. And finally the pressure treated with the cut end, and interestingly this one is completely solid on the surface that was actually down on the ground. At the end here, something has been eaten away at this quite a lot. I can't break it down with my finger though, and the other end looks good. This one was difficult to quantify, seeing as the face that was on the ground was in really good shape, but because of the small amount of damage to the end grain, I'm going to rate this 0.7 out of 10 and 1 out of 10 for softness. And finally, onto the samples that were put into a bucket of water, and interestingly, all 4 of these samples to me look pretty much identical. I can't see any signs of decay or rot on them. There was some white fungus when I took them out of the water, and that was on all 4 of the samples in roughly equal measures. But yeah, maybe the best way to preserve timber is to keep it in water by the looks of things. So
and you see this in logs that are brought off the bottom of a lake, you know, that have been there for decades, that are in completely great shape. And if you think about, so rot they call it the aerobic zone. So it's where you see rot with posts that are in the ground is the aerobic zone, typically 12 inches from the surface. So you need oxygen, you need moisture to promote life that then feeds on the whatever the wood is you're putting in the ground. So by putting in water, you're obviously taking away the oxygen, especially the deeper in the water, the less oxygen is available even in the water. Probably not surprising. Now, he did show that the bucket did empty at one point. So I would guess in several points throughout probably their summers, but interesting to see no damage. But if you think about the fact that they were probably submerged the majority of a year in that 3-year span, maybe not surprising.
Yeah, I'm going to declare this test null and void because they all look the same to me. They are very heavy though, so they've got an awful lot of water inside them. I also thought I should factor in grain tightness into the data because obviously timber with tighter growth rings is harder and therefore presumably more difficult for bugs or insects to eat. So I counted up all the growth rings and included that information in the set of data. So what have we learned? Well, firstly, treatments and preservatives aside, it's apparent that the softest sample of wood in my experiment after 3 years was also the one with the least growth rings.
Interesting to see. What do you guys think of the results? I mean, obviously, it looks like the pressure treated with the uncut end fared the best. So he has a question here about possible grain defect on the uncut being in direct ground contact. The pressure treated products themselves outperformed obviously the untreated. The surprising part is what he's calling the self-treated fared the worst if you look at the overall, even as compared to untreated. which I find surprising. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Always love to interact with you guys in the comments section. For now, Joe Everest, the fence expert, reminding you that good fences make good neighbors, and I'll see you next time.